What if Dina Carroll had the Amory style go-go sound? Hi, I'm Morgan Brown and welcome to What If, How, When, Why, where I explore the artists, songs and genres behind my what if scenarios and also provide a bit of a practical insight into how I go about making these fantasy versions a reality. If you're new to the channel, I should just explain, every Monday I upload what I call a what if video. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a changing set of circumstances cause that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that and record a new backing track to it in order to bring this alternative version into reality. So this week, for my New Year special, the song that I chose was Perfect Year by Dina Carroll. I tried to reimagine that as if it had been produced in the style of the go-go soul records that Rich Harrison produced with Amory on the likes of One Thing, and also with Beyonce on Crazy in Love, and even Jennifer Lopez on Get Right. It's quite possible here in the 21st century that you're not familiar at all with Dina Carroll. Certainly if you're watching from the States or from anywhere other than the UK and mainland Europe, she's probably completely passed you by. Even if you are in the UK, it's quite likely that she hasn't really registered on your consciousness at all in this day and age, which is kind of a shame. For people of my generation who grew up in the 90s, she was kind of a massive deal for a good few years. You know, Mercury Music Prize nominated, multi-platinum selling recording artist, and the bright young hope for British soul and R&B in the early 90s for a good little while. And I feel like, as happens with a lot of British soul and R&B singers, she was really sort of let down by the industry, which has never really known what to do with British R&B talent. And so she first started appearing on records in the late 80s, initially did a lot of feature appearances just on various dance singles, and started having hits as a featured vocalist on records by Quartz, but then got a record deal to make records under her own name and was paired with a producer called Nigel Lewis. I mean, her debut album was really quite a sensation in the UK. She's always been a terrific singer, really strong, powerful soul voice, alto in register, so not screeching Mariah Carey whistle register stuff. It's rich, hearty kind of soul voice. And that debut album, a lot of it is certainly co-written by Dina Carroll herself, along with her producer. And you get the feeling when she's writing for herself that she does have quite a lot of kind of classic soul and R&B influences in there. They're often kind of channeled into these four on the floor, dance floor fillers, which is very much what the industry wanted at the time. But there's clearly songwriting talent there as well. But yeah, the album's very much divided between these R&B tinged dance tracks and then big ballads, which still feel pretty firmly rooted in the 80s to me. They're obviously going for the belting kind of Whitney Houston power ballad feel, which was already starting to sound a bit passé in the early 90s, but was still shifting units, I guess. So like the really big hits that is largely remembered by today are generally these ballads, songs by outside writers that were given to her to record. Don't Be a Stranger was a massive one for her. And, you know, fair enough, it's a decent enough song and she really sells it well, but very much in that 80s Whitney Houston belting ballad mold. And then a little bit later on in 1993, you get The Perfect Year, which is actually a song from Lloyd Webber's musical adaptation of Sunset Boulevard, of all things. And these records did really well, but I think looking back, you can kind of see that the way they chose to portray Dina Carroll and the material that they gave her to sing really kind of stymied her career quite early on. I think a lot of UK soul and R&B acts were still being shoehorned into creating the kind of music that I would associate with late 80s yuppie wine bar music, if you know what I mean. Slightly jazz funk inflected dance tracks and glossy electric piano, shimmery power ballads, almost willfully oblivious of contemporary trends in R&B at the time. I mean, while all this is going on, I guess the New Jack Swing movement had been in effect for quite a few years, and you've already got the likes of Janet and Michael Jackson, some really big names moving in this kind of more hip-hop influenced direction. And that's only going to continue through the 90s. 1 year after The Perfect Year comes out, Blackstreet are releasing No Diggity. En Vogue's big breakthrough album was out the same year as this first Dina Carroll album, and they just sound so much more modern than what was happening with Dina Carroll and with these other UK acts. So that first album, as I say, was a massive hit. It took a couple of years for her to get another record out, and by that point the tide was already very much turning in terms of what was expected of a soul or R&B singer. It still sold plenty of copies, but was nowhere near the kind of smash that the first one was. And as so often happens, I think like the record company just sort of lost their nerve in a way. So you got some hints of a third album coming out. They tested the water with a couple of singles, but ultimately basically just ditched all their efforts to make a third album and just released the greatest hits instead. Just got really let down by an industry that just did not know what to do with a UK soul singer. And she's still performing to this day, and I'm sure she's still amazing as well, but there's still not been a third album. It just never happened, and I think that's a real shame. As I say, this week's video was really intended to be a New Year special. I was just trying to think of songs that had something to do with New Year, and The Perfect Year popped into my head because it's all about looking forward into the new year with hope and expectation. So I thought that would be a good choice for a New Year song. I've always hated the song, I must admit. I really like a lot of musical theatre, I should explain, but Lloyd Webber's a total hack. I'm sorry, he just is. Deeply overrated. And I mean, I don't know what the whole deal is with Sunset Boulevard, but the fact that you could take such great source material as that amazing Billy Wilder movie and then end up with something that has this kind of saccharine nonsense in it is totally beyond me. So it's a really drippy, deeply middle of the road, soporific ballad that represents kind of the worst of that late 80s, early 90s kind of power balladry. So my thought was there must be something we could do to this wet song that would make it sound more exciting, kind of give it a bit more of the treatment that a singer as good as Dina Carroll deserves. And for me, the most exciting R&B production ever was probably that on One Thing by A-Marie. Now, One Thing was produced by Rich Harrison, who has gone on to do a ton of stuff. I guess one of his first major projects was A-Marie's first album. And I think one of the things that they were working towards on that album was a fusion of contemporary R&B with elements of classic soul and also go-go, which if you don't know, I guess a lot of people who aren't from the States maybe aren't that familiar with it. Go-go's a native musical form of the Washington DC and Maryland kind of area, a form of funk music, but with some quite unique characteristics. It's got a heavy call and response element based around more long drawn out jams rather than a tighter, more composed songs, in which respect it's got quite a lot of stuff in common with Afrobeat, really percussive, quite a lot of heavy percussion, polyrhythmic elements as well. So quite a distinctive sound, and one that's had occasional moments where it's almost broken through to a sort of broader national, international audience, but it's never quite made it in a big way. So for the most part, it remains fairly local to that particular region of the States. And A-Marie grew up mainly in DC, so that had been a big part of her childhood, and she wanted to just find a way to incorporate that element of that into her music. That's something that they were working on that first album. Never quite fully realised it on there, but obviously that was something that they were still planning to kind of develop going forward. Accounts vary, but from what I can gather, after that first A-Marie album, Rich Harrison is carrying on developing tracks, working on beats. In the midst of this, Beyonce has launched a solo career. Her first single, Work It Out, I don't think it was a flop, but it didn't necessarily do what the record company was expecting it to do. And she's on the same label as A-Marie, so I guess while shopping around for a follow-up, she gets put in touch with Rich Harrison, and he's got a track that he's been working on in this go-go soul hybrid style that him and Marie had developed together. And so he takes that to Beyonce, and that becomes Crazy in Love, which obviously, as we know now, was a massive, massive hit. So Beyonce is the first person to chart with this sound, which certainly by some accounts is actually a sound that was developed by her label mate Marie. So by the time Marie came to releasing that second album, the cat was kind of already out of the bag, because Rich Harrison had already jumped the gun and used that sound with other artists by that point. But still, One Thing, which was the lead single from that second album, I think is one of the greatest pop records ever made. I mean, Crazy in Love's awesome. It's got the big Chai Lights sample, the huge horns. It's got the heavy kind of go-go percussion. It's got the chanting chorus, which again is a bit of a go-go element. One Thing keeps that blasting, heavy, layered percussion, but it's got a lightness of touch to it as well, which I think is lacking from Crazy in Love. It's got this really fine balance between this absolutely pounding groove, but then this light and air vocal that just kind of skims along over the top of it. I just think it's a remarkable piece of work, and one that just totally stands up 20 years later. I think because Beyonce got out sooner with that sound, and because Beyonce was on the same label, Marie was always going to be kind of second fiddle there. And it does feel like to some extent her career was, if not sabotaged, then deliberately neglected. She was definitely a lower priority at the label than Queen Bee was there. And by the time she got around to making the third album, Because I Love It, which is my favorite of her records, I mean, that didn't even come out in the States for a full year on any kind of physical format, which is pretty much a death knell for her career. It's such a shame. But yeah, if you do get the chance, definitely check it out. At least the first half of it. I'm not a massive fan of the ballads, but all the up-tempo songs are absolutely amazing, including Gotta Work, which is again in this go-go style, not produced by Rich Harrison, but it's very much in that kind of same style. Big classic soul sample, huge heavy go-go percussion, go-go stabs from the brass and everything. It's awesome. Yeah, I love that style, particularly when done by Marie. I mean, the Beyonce record, I can't deny, is also awesome. But yeah, Marie, like Dina Carroll, deserved so much more than she got as a performer. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, she should probably be the biggest star in the world by now. It's a kind of a travesty that she isn't, but there you go. But my thought for this week's alternative universe scenario was, if we go back to the 90s, after that second Dina Carroll album, it's done okay, but it hasn't really sold as many as the first one. It hasn't broken her in America like they were hoping. The label's a bit unsure what to do with her at this stage. So the early 2000s, they scrapped the plans for the third album. They released the Greatest Hits album. What if at this stage some bright spark at a US label had the foresight to pick her up and pair her with a really kick-ass American producer and just see what she could do? It's something that should have happened, because, I mean, she was still very much in her prime as a performer when that third album fell through, and that's so much potential. So I figure in this alternative universe, she gets picked up by a US label, she gets paired with Rich Harrison and recuts The Perfect Year in this go-go soul style and just relaunches her career for the new century. So started out by just taking Dina's isolated vocal, syncing it up to the grid on GarageBand as ever, cranked up the tempo a little bit. I didn't want it to be too fast because it still wants to have that mid-tempo funky kind of swing to it, but wanted to make sure it was danceable as well. So we've got that on there. First thing with anything that's go-go influenced, just needed some percussive elements. So all those big Rich Harrison productions are based around vintage samples. So they don't have that metronomic drum machine thing that you hear on a lot more contemporary records these days, although I think there are programmed elements in the background as well. So for the drum loop, I selected a vintage sounding kit and just played it in manually on my MIDI keyboard. Normally when I've played things in, I'll quantize them, tidy them up, and just try and make sure everything's pretty neatly in time. With this, I didn't do too much of that at all, because I wanted it to still feel kind of loose, like it was being played in by an actual drummer. So just created a 4-bar section and then just looped that through all the verses. There's another couple of bar section that I used for the choruses and for the intro as well. I wanted that combination of vintage and modern sounds. So underneath that, there's a drum machine sound as well, which is just kind of reinforcing the kick drum and keeping a bit more of an electronic pulse going underneath that analog sounding acoustic kit. And then for a bit more go-go authenticity, we just add some more layers of percussion as we go along. So I delved into the GarageBand loop browser and picked out there's some congas and forgotten what some kind of drum which sounded quite interesting. So we just add some layers of these loops as we go along, building it up just to sound like there's a bit of a kind of army of percussionists on there. Played on some bass, kept that pretty simple. I didn't want to do anything too showy. I've got a pair of guitars on there, just with a fairly clean, slightly reverby sound, fairly vintage sounding. There's one on each side, just blasting out these chords, but they're mixed fairly low, so it's nothing too ostentatious. And then in the second verse, I also added a piano, which joins in on some of those chords as well. Again, quite low in the mix, but just to provide a little bit of different texture in there too. The main sort of defining feature of the instrumentation is obviously the brass. On these Rich Harrison productions, that's normally going to be a sample. I wasn't using actual samples, so I just had to play it in using whatever sounds I had available. So it's a mixture of GarageBand's own horn sounds and some from the Spitfire Audio BBC SO Discover pack. I added quite a lot of distortions to them as well, just to make them sound a bit more forceful, a bit more R&B where possible. And then throughout the rest of the song, there's an electric piano that comes in, just playing a little melodic figure that plays off against the vocal. And also, one of the things that I really like on One Thing by A. Marie is the strings that come in, slightly mysterious sounding strings. They're not kind of a major feature of the record, but they just kind of insinuate themselves and kind of snake their way around the vocal. So to try and recreate a bit of that feel, I used the Mellotron strings from GarageBand and just popped a few little phrases of that in there, nothing too over the top, just like another little instrumental texture in there too. Then for the video, I decided I'll combine some performance footage of her from, I think it's an old Top of the Pops, with a bit of an homage to actual DC go-go. I really enjoyed finding out about go-go music and watching a bunch of documentaries while doing this, so I wanted to get some flavour of that scene into this video. So as well as Dina Carroll, we've got some classic 80s footage from a Trouble Funk concert, Trouble Funk being one of the leading lights of the go-go scene, along with, you know, the Backyard Band and the Junkyard Band, all these great go-go bands. So you've got them kind of playing along like they're the backing bands, some cool crowd shots from that too. And then I found a bunch of really cool footage of a go-go dance called Beat Your Feet. It's just awesome. So just mix that in as well, just to give it a bit of that proper DC flavour. And hopefully the whole thing comes together into a coherent kind of package. I don't know. I feel like I managed to perk up a fairly dreary song and make it into something a little bit more exciting. And I also hopefully managed to successfully pay homage to one of my favourite R&B production styles, and also to do justice to a really good and really underrated UK soul singer as well. So hopefully it wasn't too bad. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm already getting to work on January's content, so if there's anything you'd like me to try in the new year, any songs you'd like me to take a look at, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, please do let me know. I always welcome your suggestions. I've had a couple of cool suggestions which I'm going to try and work on in the coming weeks. But yeah, otherwise that's it for me for this week. So I wish you a very happy new year, and I'll see you next time.